What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with the Immortal Thor. Normally we would cover Venom War, but there's not a whole lot to cover this week. But Immortal Thor is ridiculously overpowered in this comic. He gains a whole new level of power that's absolutely mind-blowing. But what this does here is this picks up with Thor traveling to meet with Hercules. Now, there is a little bit of context to this that I want to provide, which is to say there was a story arc that took place before this that was a couple issues long. It wasn't overly important. The only thing that really came out of it is that for whatever reason that we don't fully understand, Enchantress had basically cast a spell that was designed to essentially make Thor dumb whenever he came to Earth. Now, that was part of a grander tapestry, kind of a scheme that Enchantress was involved in, which was to quote unquote rewrite the legend of Thor. We don't really know what the grand goal is. We just know that's kind of what she's doing. But the other part of that story is that Thor had actually killed Minotaur, who was basically the head of Roxxon Oil. And he did it publicly. He did it unintentionally, but he did it publicly. And so the Avengers can't really aid him because now he's just kind of a fugitive. And because of the spell of Enchantress, he doesn't really come to Earth all that often. But he is coming here to visit with Hercules for a particular purpose. And there is a kind of revisiting some of the things that had happened, and because it's been so long, we will cover those. One of the things that Hercules talks about is the idea of Thor fighting Tyrannos in New York, and the fact that even though Thor is the Allfather, basically meaning he has the Odin force within him, it was all he could do to hold his own against this guy, and ultimately he didn't even beat Tyrannos. He just sent him away right to a dimension, and like that was it. He couldn't actually overpower him because that's just how powerful Tyrannos was. And so what happens is the conversation shifts to a woman known as Nyx, NYX, which coincidentally was actually the name of a comic book line in Marvel Comics and is the current name of a comic book line in Marvel as well. But in this instance, they're referring to a woman called the Goddess of Night. Now, she actually debuted in Marvel in a story called Avengers, I think it was No Road Home. And the long and short of it is that she's as much metatextual as she is physical, in the sense that as the Goddess of the Night, she's the most powerful when she's in a place where there is night. But one of the things that goes on here is that in their discussions about the nature of Nyx, that what happens is Thor says the Avengers defeated her. Indeed, the Vision used the very forces of creation to banish her, to exile her. But Hercules says, tell me, Thor, how many times has night fallen on the whole world since then? And that's where Thor chimes in with the Blood Hunt, which we just recently covered. And it was a story designed to build on the popularity of Blade, which of course, nothing ever came of that. So the story kind of floundered. And so that's where Thor says, I see thy meaning, we will need help. Because their goal right now is to go and deal with Nyx. But what I want to specify is that in the current Immortal Thor run, it kind of requires you to take a step back. And what you'll notice here over the entire Immortal Thor run is that Thor is involved in these small little stories, these small little skirmishes, because they're all part of a much bigger thing. And that's what we'll kind of circle back around to as we get back into the idea of the Elder Gods and different things like that. Now, of course, it also turns out that Loki had kind of snuck along for the ride. So Loki, Hercules, and Thor end up traveling to the Antarctic because at this time of year, the Antarctic is in a state of perpetual darkness, right? The sun doesn't rise in that part of the world. And so because of this, once they get there, there's a kind of conversation like, okay, let's just like get this done and over with, and let's go face off against this woman, only for her to emerge having found them first. And what's interesting, and this is where things get kind of cool, is what they say is the Queen of Night is not recovering, she's recovered all of her power and more. And that's where the question is asked, then why hasn't she taken her vengeance on the world as a whole? Why not attack everybody? And that's where Hercules says, I know not. We spoke her name, that alone should have brought her to our door, yet she stayed here amassing power. For what? What could she possibly be doing? And that's when it dawns on Hercules, what would the Mother of Night want more than revenge, Thor? And that's when a statement comes from a kind of disembodied person that says, what does any mother want? The best for her brood. Make a move, godlings, and Loki dies. Now, this is where you kind of learn, or at least revisit, the nature of her children. And again, when you're talking about the Thor Asgardian mythos, names represent roles. And so where you have Apate and Dolos, second and third of the Night Mother's children, Apate's blade is the rage of ignorance. Her brother's powers create illusion, and an illusion caused their bitter end at the Night Queen's own hand, in the sense that she was basically tricked into killing her own kids. But because of the vast amount of power that she has, she was able to bring them back, right? And that's where she chimes in and she says, "An endless night called me back from dust and ash, son of Zeus, to avenge myself on the Avengers. A second endless night restored my power, and with it I journeyed here. You were correct when you spoke my name. I needed natural dark. I needed this cold womb to bring life to the children I lost." So that's literally what she's doing here, right? She's staying in this place and consolidating her power to restore her children. And while she would likely stay in this place for the foreseeable future, that's what Hercules was talking about when he said, how many instances have there been where by one means or another, perpetual darkness encases the world, right? During the events of the King in Black, we saw that like Null showed up and covered the world in a kind of symbiote goo that blocked out the sun. During Blood Hunt, it was dark force energy that did the exact same thing. And so that's what she's talking about, right? That basically King in Black is what restored her. Blood Hunt is what brought her power back, or really pushed it further and allowed her to bring her kids back. And so ultimately what would happen is that when another event like that transpires, that is going to lead to her making her move, right? So at this point, if they don't defeat her now, then it's the end times. And what happens is that following this, her firstborn, Hypnos, steps onto the scene and goes to attack Hercules. Now, here's the funny thing, and this is where the story gets amazing, because Thor gets so overpowered in this comic. In this moment where Thor is backed against the wall, Hercules is on the verge of being killed alongside Loki, Thor lets loose for a second. Now, this is not the overpowered point, but he completely lets loose, and then in turn says, "I am no stranger to dark despair, creature. I know its call well, but when I am needed, the call to action is greater." And so what it does is it allows Hercules to be freed, but that turns the attention to the children of Nyx. And what happens is Loki gets his throat slit. And that's what's crazy, is because Thor looks on and just says, "You should not have done that, Aphade." And when they respond and asking, "Have I made you angry, Viking?" Good. Anger is what I am goddess of. That's when you find that Loki had basically duped the two of them, and the sister had slit her brother's throat. Again, manipulating illusions, ultimately resulting in their own demise. And that's when the god of stories Loki pops up onto the scene. Now, one of the things that I want to specify here, because Al Ewing is very Grant Morrison-esque in terms of how he writes his comic books, very metatextual, making references to things. Loki kind of exists in a couple different forms. As the god of stories Loki, it's Loki at his most powerful. So effectively, god of stories Loki can just write anything into existence and it becomes real instantaneously. So for example, god of stories Loki could say, "I see this story going in the direction to where everybody has now become elephants," and like they're suddenly elephants, right? It's just extreme reality warping on a level that would rival that of any multiversal cosmic entity that we've ever seen. But the idea is that Loki is also kind of bound by the story, which is to say, Loki's like, things have to progress a certain way. How they progress, I can't tell you. So it's basically just Al Ewing saying, Loki can do anything, but I'm writing the story, so Loki just does whatever I tell them to. And that's really all it is. But it's almost kind of like a separate personality, in the sense that when God of Loki manifests, nobody knows what's going to happen. But when the God of Loki version just kind of retreats, he just turns back into regular Loki. And then it's just regular Loki doing whatever it is that they do over the course of a story. It's a little weird and a little wonky, and even I have a difficult time wrapping my head around it. It's just kind of a cool thing. That's why I tend to look at the God of Stories Loki and the normal Loki as almost like multiple personalities within the same being, right? It's just kind of strange. The bigger thing is that Thor points out to Hercules, this is Loki's true and most powerful form, and the unpredictable nature of this God of Stories Loki makes them my enemy. Now, one of the things that had gone on over the course of Immortal Thor is that God of Stories Loki knows how everything is going to turn out, but they can't tell Thor how things are going to turn out. And so all that really happened in the early issues of the comic is that God of Stories Loki had told Thor, I will test you. I will come out from time to time. I will manifest and I will turn your world upside down. And what that's going to do is put you in a circumstance where it's going to push your abilities to their limits. Either you will die or you will succeed. There will be no in between. But all of this is to prepare you for what's coming later, further down the road. And so what happens here is that because of the power of God of Stories Loki, that the Queen of Nights is powerless in the face of this, right? God of Stories Loki just whisks them off to a dimension with no sun whatsoever. And so where you have have Thor and Loki kind of standing here trying to figure out what in the world is going on. They're suddenly met by the arrival of Zeus. One of the things that had happened in Marvel is that during Avengers No Road Home, we had learned that while Zeus himself, along with the other Olympians, was destroyed by Nyx because they are fundamental to existence, which is to say people have worshipped them, and even though they're destroyed, people would never forget them. They would ultimately come back, quote unquote, in their true forms, which was kind of a way for Marvel to say that it's impossible to truly kill Zeus, that as a mythological being, he would always be reincarnated. It just may take time, right? And so the result was that Zeus ultimately returned along with the other Olympians. Now, during Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 6, there came a point where the Guardians faced off against Zeus in what were called the Dark Olympians. Ultimately, the Olympians were defeated, but Zeus himself was shot with a kind of black hole bullet, which sent him to this dimension, right? A place with no suns whatsoever, a place of endless night. And that's why he's here. But Marvel is actually going to change their history along with the very nature of the origin of Asgard itself, which is really dope in terms of this story. And in fact, that's what we do here. We transition to Rhea meeting with Gaia. Now, one of the things that Marvel's done when it came to the Olympian mythos is they hadn't really done much in the way of shifting it. That the idea here was that you had Uranos, who was just like a titan, an extremely old being, that Kronos killed his father Uranos, and then in order to avoid the prophecy that Kronos himself would be killed by one of his own sons, every time his children were born, he would consume them. And so Rhea gave birth to Zeus and then took off and hid Zeus. What we're given here is the idea that Rhea had taken Zeus to Gaia, the biological mother of Thor, and hid him away there. Now, she didn't necessarily intend to do that. The idea from Rhea was that Zeus, having been born, will be known by Kronos. He won't know where Zeus is or anything like that, but he will simply just be able to sense his existence. And so what Gaia did is she offered a kind of rock as Mother Earth and said this will sustain Kronos, who won't be paying attention to what he's eating or even what's in the cloth. He'll just consume it, right? Believing it's his son Zeus. It's a way for Marvel to change the origin of Zeus in Marvel Comics, but keep the mythology intact in saying that Zeus survived the great purge of Kronos and then returned to kill his father and then seized control of Mount Olympus. The cool thing here is that it invokes the idea of Utgard. Now, this is where I want to step back from the story for a second, and I want to talk about what Marvel has changed when it came to the Asgardian mythos. One of the things that had happened here in Marvel was that we didn't really know the origin of Asgard. Suffice it to say that, like, Ymir was born and that was it. Sometime between his existence and a point in time, Asgard came into existence, and that was it. One of the things that Marvel established in, I think it was Immortal Thor issue number 11 or 12, was that there was a being named Tiwaz, and Tiwaz was one of the elder gods on Earth, and that when the war among the elder gods led by Chthon had broken out, that this led to basically the rise of Atum, right, who essentially destroyed all the elder gods. The way it works with Utgard as well as Asgard is that when those elder gods who weren't destroyed fled, they all took off to their own individual dimensions. Utgard is a wholly different dimension out there. The idea, though, was that instead of one god going to their own plane of existence, that Utgard Loki, which is just kind of a artificial name to give us this understanding that, like, that is a elder god of tricks, essentially, that they had actually created this Utgard realm and then invited all these gods to it, simply because of the fact that there's safety in numbers. For Tiwaz, what he had done is he had fled to the dimension that we now know as Asgard, and that following him being frozen and then ultimately thawed out, he renamed himself into Bori, and then he had Bor, who in turn had Odin. And so that's where all of Asgard comes into existence, which is kind of cool because now in Marvel Comics, we have a through line. We know exactly how Asgard came into existence, and we know when the kingdom of Asgard was being built. The fact is here though, right, when it came to the idea of Utgard, what Gaia seemed to know is that somehow or another, that those Utgard gods, those elder gods, will escape. It's only a matter of time before they manage to break their way out of that dimension dimension and then travel to Earth. When that happens, there has to be someone there capable of stopping them. And for the same reason that the X-Men fight Juggernaut or Scarlet Witch fights Chthon, that this is Thor's battle. Now, it may end up turning out to be a giant crossover event that involves all the superheroes on Earth, but Thor will be leading the charge. And so what happens is that Gaia looks at Zeus and realizes, okay, you will not be the one to destroy the Utgard elder gods when they emerge, but you will be the means by which somebody else will, specifically Thor. And so what she did is provide, quote unquote, the key to Utgard, which is to say the power by which to open this door. It's also a literal physical key that was embedded into the essence of Zeus himself. The reason why this matters is because jumping back to this conflict between Thor and Zeus, Thor relishes in this idea of a conflict because he says this is godly business and it does seem very much like Thor's business. Now, this is why I say Zeus is written amazing here because he says your business, you, a petty nothing god, thunderer of a brutal and backwater land, worshipped by barbarians, by raiders and savages. My worshippers invented reason, conjured philosophy. Civilization was born from their vast intellects, while your meager thralls squatted in huts. Your only business with me, Squall God, is to kiss the ground at my feet, and just like hurls a thunderbolt at Thor. It's amazing. I have never seen like Zeus written so awesome in Marvel. It's so dope. But lest we forget, right? Immortal Thor, everything builds on everything else. What happened when Storm conjured lightning to attack Thor? He was like, that's cute, but I'm the god of thunderstorms. So whenever Zeus throws a lightning bolt at Thor, as the god of storms, he just says, turn, and the lightning bolt turns. It dodges, like it goes away. It goes in a different direction. And he's like, my thanks, little lightning. I had no quarrel with thee, only with thy so-called master. And that is the business I have with thee, Zeus of the philosophers, the business of storm gods, the business of sky fathers. And that's where Nyx shows back up again and says, and only sky fathers, Thor, for the sky mother would speak with you all. And of course, Zeus lashes out because Nyx was the one that had killed him. And in turn, there's a kind of back and forth, right? Where she says, and would that my snapping of your fat neck had taken. And there's just a kind of back and forth between them where she's like, yeah, basically I did, right? And I would do it again if I had the chance. She's like, but it seems that reborn Zeus is as proud and arrogant as the Zeus that came before. And so it's just kind of taunting him a little bit. Now Thor chimes in and he says, and that is why we sought you out, Mother of Night. Was his return your doing? What do you know of the wheel that turned in him? And her response is, what could I know of such? I am not your mother, who is the changing of the season. I am not the rising of the sun, and I am not its setting. I am simply the cold calm of the midnight, the stillness of the breeze, the chirp of the crickets, and the moon that hangs overhead. Now, here's kind of what's going on behind the scenes here, which is really cool. When it comes to these fantastically powerful beings in Marvel Comics, they're all kind of aware of each other, right? Gaia knows about, Nyx, and Nyx knows about Gaia, and Eternity knows about all the elder gods, and everybody knows about everybody else. But when it comes to lesser beings like Thor, despite being an incredibly powerful god unto himself, his power pales in comparison to all these others. When it comes to characters like Zeus and Hercules and so on, they're always slowly figuring this stuff out, right? They're always kind of learning what everybody else has known this entire time. Because when you're talking about elder gods and you're talking about beings that represent the fundamental forces of Earth or the universe itself, they've been around since time immemorial. In the case of Nyx, she originates with the Great Void, the same place that Null comes from. It can be argued that she's like a facsimile of the cosmic entity Oblivion, but the fact is, she's been around since before the universe existed. So she's seen a lot and she knows a lot. And so what happens is, in the midst of all this, Thor conjures the dimensional winds, which allows him to basically leave this immediate place and travel to another location within this realm. Because when Nyx says the moon that hangs overhead, she's bringing that thing down on him. right? Like Zeus is just standing there and gets smashed by the moon. And that's when Loki reappears alongside Athena. Now this is cool because Athena is the Olympian god of wisdom. And so while neither Loki nor Athena are going to say, okay, Thor, do this, and this is how you win. Instead, it's kind of, again, some banter, some back and forth, where Hercules says, I mislike running from a fight, Thor. And he says, whether it is with my errant father or she who made him as he is now through bloody murder. But Thor responds in saying, there speaks the hothead Hercules that I've known. And he says, and I fear his hour of battle will come soon enough. I bought a moment to think, not to flee. It's Loki's rune spell that holds us in this sunless realm. The dimensional winds can relocate us within it, but not return us to where we came from. Not until the riddle is solved. Not until I know what it is that I'm supposed to do. Because that's really all this is. Again, Loki told Thor very early on, when I appear, it is to bring a riddle to your doorstep, and I will send you to a place, or I will test you. And until you solve that riddle, you will stay there, right? Because it's all designed towards making Thor more powerful. And so that's why Thor turns to Athena and Loki and he says, Loki, you are my kin, so I accept you in all your aspects. You are the teller, and such is the tale, but it is my tale. Hercules did not need to be a part of it. So basically, Hercules is just caught in all this nonsense. Let him go. Let him go do his thing, right? And he says, I could say the same for Tyr and poor lost Hermit, but I warn thee, Loki, my patience is not forever. But Loki responds and says, how many times, Thor, this is no game. You faced a test and gained a weapon, the sharp axe of your wit, first of 3. Your second test is upon you now, and the rune we play by is Uru's, rune of endurance and tenacity, of courage against the odds, a rune of my name. So this is the coolest thing here, because what Loki's basically saying is the first test that I put you through was to test your intelligence, to make you think outside the box. So you would be more than just this brute being who runs around with a hammer smashing everything, right? Now we're going to test your endurance. How long can you undertake a fight, a battle? Because what happens is Athena chimes in, and where Hercules asks, and why couldn't we learn this lesson at home? She says, because it is not his trial alone, brother, and some trials cannot be avoided. And that's where Zeus reappears and says, you speak true, daughter, but there is no escape from our power. Because Zeus has allied himself with Nyx, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And with them working together, he says, we have reached an accord. She is a being of great power and great darkness. And the Zeus that was saw in her a being to be feared. I see a mirror. Together we shall raise a new race of deathless gods to conquer all that is. So Zeus has just kind of become corrupted. Now again, tying into what Guardians of the Galaxy established, Avengers No Road Home, that this is Zeus's true form, that Zeus is more malevolent than benevolent or even indifferent. He seeks to conquer everything. And that's kind of what happens, is because what takes place here is a fight breaks out between Thor and Zeus himself. And what happens is that Thor just goads Zeus over and over and over again. That where Zeus keeps throwing lightning bolts at him, that Thor is just kind of like, I control the storms, I control the lightning, I control your power. So no matter how many lightning bolts you throw, they are never going to reach me. It's never going to happen. And it just drives Zeus crazy. And so again, like Thor just keeps saying turn, but the reality here is it's a stalemate, right? Zeus is throwing lightning bolts, Thor is dodging them. And this is going to go on seemingly forever. Thor's not learning the lesson that he's supposed to learn. He's not solving the riddle, but Hercules is the one that actually figures it out, right? He says, do as he says, Thor. That is the answer, right? This, of course, in response to Zeus saying, stop flinching, take my power like a god. And that's why Hercules says, you have to take it like a god. And so in turn, Thor is like, of course, right? That's what the riddle is. The power of Zeus, the lightning bolts, they must be endured, for enduring them may give us deeper strength. So let me get in close. And again, it's a kind of back and forth, right? Where Thor sort of taunts Zeus and talks about how, oh, you know, your forces and your worshippers and philosophers ciphers and so on and so forth. Show me what you have, right? Like, show me how capable you are, right? Like, show me how capable you are. And Zeus, charging up all his power, simply says, you could turn the lightning when I hurled it from afar, peasant god, but how will you deflect it when I summon it inside of you? And so Hercules is just kind of like, all right, like, I've been wrong before. But then he talks directly to Nyx herself, and her trying to escape, right, this place of no sons whatsoever. Zeus really shows his intelligence here, despite how often he's shown to be a goof. He's actually very capable, and he tells her, like, I get that you want to destroy me, right? Like, you want to see Thor destroyed by Zeus, but ask yourself, isn't this what you've always been looking for? You want to be in a place where your power reigns supreme because there is no light. We're in a dimension of endless night. This is everything you could possibly want here. Now, of course, it was the actions of Loki that sent her here, but as the god of stories, Loki is always in control. There's nothing that happens that Loki doesn't know about. So what this was testing the intelligence of even Hercules himself. Can you figure out the gift I've given you? And the gift that's been given to Hercules and to Thor is, I've given you a means to remove Nyx from the board, right? Show her what I've given her and she'll lose the desire to fight, because now she has everything she wants. That's when she realizes where she's at and ultimately kind of just abandons everything, right? It's like, okay, Zeus, you're on your own. Now, as for Zeus himself, this is awesome, because what happens is that Loki tells everybody, watch this, right? Watch what happens next, because Thor is really solving the riddle here, where Zeus says, curse you Norsemen, you should be naught but an ember in the face of this power. You should be burning as fuel. The response of Thor, a fitting analogy, Zeus, for one of us is fuel. I spoke earlier that we shared the business of Skyfathers, and the business of Skyfathers is power, the all power. You pour yours into me as if I were not already the vessel for it. You have graciously given so much, Lord of Olympus, now give me the rest. And Zeus like literally begs and says no, and Thor's just like, I said, give me it all. And just like absorbs all of Zeus's power unto himself. And that's why he says the power of Zeus and the power of Odin in one god. And when you have Hercules who looks at Thor almost kind of terrified, right? Like he's an quote unquote echo of darkness, that Thor simply just says, you have nothing to fear, Hercules. You surely will understand. I see it so clearly now. And where Hercules asks, what is it do you see? Thor doesn't give an answer, but he looks amazing. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Let me know what you think down in the comments section. We got a few weeks until issue number 15 comes out. I know you guys are going to be begging for it. And I will catch you all later. Peace.